which leads me to the broader aspect of diversity within the judiciary. One of the questions which we are posed is this: why don't you have more women in the judiciary? Why don't you have more people belonging to the marginalized groups in the judiciary? Now, one thing which we need to understand is that the judiciary has a feeding pool. Now, which is the feeding pool for the higher judiciary? The feeding pool for the Supreme Court is either the high courts or the lawyers from the bar. What is the feeding pool for the high courts? The feeding pool for the high courts is the district judiciary or the lawyers who practice before the high courts. Now, what has happened, therefore, is that the feeding pool which determines who enters our judiciary is largely dependent on the structure of the legal profession. The structure of the legal profession, even today across India, is feudal, it's patriarchal, and it has not been accommodating of women. So when we talk of the need to have more women in the judiciary, it's equally necessary for us to lay the building blocks for the future by creating access to women now within the legal profession. Entering chambers of senior counsel, it's an old boys club. How do you gain access to chambers? You gain access to chambers by tapping your connections, by tapping your networks. Until we have a democratized and merit-based access to the entry point in the legal profession, we'll not have more women. We will not have more people belonging to the marginalized groups entering the profession. I have 5 law clerks in my office, and I've made an effort to ensure that the usual system of accessing chambers, which is that somebody calls you up and say, hey, somebody I know wants access to your office and who wants to work with you for a year, must be replaced by a more merit-based system of appointment. And when I talk of merit, let's make no bones about it. Merit in the conventional sense in our society is also a product of our cultural stereotypes. Because merit is also determined by who can speak English well. Merit is also dependent on who went to the right colleges. Merit is also dependent on who had access to the best coaching classes when they were kids. Merit is also dependent on who learned to play the violin or the piano or went to a good club to learn swimming when they were 9 or 10. So everything that we look upon today as merit is not necessarily what merit is all about. When we seek access to our law schools, today, admission to our law schools is determined by your scores in a uniform, the common law aptitude test, the CLAT. What is the CLAT test? Does it test how you're going to be 30 years down the line when you assume a position of responsibility? Or does it just tell you whether you are able to mug your scores, your questions, whether it's general knowledge or math or English, in a proper way? So how do we define merit, which is the next important thing which I want to talk to you very briefly before I conclude? How do we talk about merit in terms of the entry point into the judiciary? Do we talk about merit only in terms of the income which people earn? Then typically you will have a certain kind of people entering the judiciary. Or do we also talk about merit in terms of the social ethos of the cases for whom you represent? A woman lawyer, for instance, may be appearing for labor. She may not have large fees at her command, but she's doing that as a sense of mission to the society. So I think when we talk about broadening diversity within the Indian judiciary, we also need to have a very hard look at how we conceive of merit and how we think of diversity. Why diversity? Why do you need more women judges? Is a judge not a judge? Does it make a difference whether you're a man or woman who is deciding a case? Why do you need more women judges in the judiciary? Is it that women bring some particular gender perspective to judging? I have sat with both my male counterparts and my female counterparts. And I've found that when I sat with a woman and dealt with a case be it a case of a gender offense against a woman. In the criminal appeals that we hear, you will see that there is such almost a monotonous regularity of the kind of offenses which take place against a woman. I was sitting with a very distinguished colleague, Justice Ranjana Desai, when I first entered the criminal roster, and she said, Dhananjay, just watch the cases involving offenses against women. In most of them, you will find a nylon rope, a can of kerosene, and a matchstick. So there is a certain perspective, I believe, which having a broader sense of diversity brings to the judiciary. It doesn't necessarily mean that women judges will be more liberal as compared to their male counterparts. That's a wrong assumption. To postulate that when you have a woman judge, she will adopt a particular ideological approach to her task of judging is wrong. It's not that men judges are, more conservative than their women counterparts. No, that's not my thesis. My thesis is that there is something intrinsic about gender, irrespective of the outcomes which you arrive at in individual case, which brings to the table a more deliberative, a more consultative, and a more dialogic process to the art and the science of judging.